Sony FS6 is an overall improvement over the Sony FS5, and since it pretty much fixes every single one of my issues that I had with the Sony FS5, I'm dying to get my hands on one. But there are three different things that are kind of a setback with this camera that we're gonna go over. The first problem I have with this camera is the XLR ports for the camera are on the grip. Now if we look at the Sony FS5, we got two XLR ports on this camera, just like how we do on the FX6. But on this camera, one of the XLR ports is right here in the front of the camera, at the front. That's on the grip itself. And then the second one's on the back of the camera, on the camera itself. Which means that if you take up the top handle of this camera, you still have one XLR port that you can use with it. I have my wireless lav mic right here on the back that's attached to the XLR port on the back, so that there's no cables running around from back of the camera to the front. It keeps it very clean. And I have a shotgun mic at the front of the camera that attaches to the front XLR port. It keeps things simple and clean, so it's not that big of a deal since you're probably gonna keep the top handle on the camera pretty much always. But it was nice that with the Sony FS5 you can take off the top handle and you still have an XLR port that you can use on the camera. Now with the new camera, for some reason, I don't know who's at the Sony headquarters decided this, but they're like, oh, you know what, let's remove that flexibility of the camera and just put two XLR ports on top of the camera. Now this wouldn't be a huge big deal if they had at least a 3.5mm jack on the camera or something. But if you take the top handle of the camera off, you pretty much have no source of audio that you can plug into your camera. There's a scratch audio on it. But again, why change that? Just keep it like how it was. Have an XLR port on the camera and then have another XLR port on the top of the camera, on the top handle, so that you have more flexibility camera with how you use it. But again, for me it's not that big of a deal because I pretty much always keep the top handle on this camera. But if you're gonna put on a gimbal and take the top handle off, then that is something to keep in mind, that you're not gonna be able to get professional audio out of the camera. Now the second and the third thing are related to each other, which is the slow motion features of both of these cameras. Now with the Sony FS5, you can do internally up to 960 FPS in 1080p and up to 30 FPS in 4K resolution. Now externally, that you can push that 4K to actually 120 FPS, which is amazing for its time. But nowadays there's a lot of cameras that are coming out that can do it internally, so it's not that amazing. But with the FX6, it's a bit of a downgrade, because in 4K resolution you can do 120 FPS internally now, which is amazing. Again, with this camera you can do it also, but you have to do it externally, so that's a big upgrade. But when it comes to 1080p, you can only do up to 240 FPS, which for most situations it's more than enough. But with the older camera, you can do up to 960 FPS, which is cool to have that option. Again, with the 960 FPS on this camera, it doesn't look that good at all. And it's not really 1080p, they kind of just lie about it. With this camera, it's more that it can do up to 240 FPS 1080p, and then you can do 480 FPS in 720p. That still looks really good. And then you can do 960 FPS in 360p with really heavy crop. So with the newer camera, I was really hoping they would still keep those features but improve on that and give us proper 960 FPS and 1080p or even 720p. That would have been fine. But they just kept it simple and just made it so that you can shoot up to 240 FPS, which I'm guessing is that they just took the same internals as the Sony a7S III, since that camera has the same identical specs. But that's a bit of a bummer for me, because I do love the fact that you can shoot up to 480 or 960 FPS with this camera. In those situations, if you're doing wildlife videography, or if you're shooting some extreme sports where people are doing crazy flips and they're hitting their head against the concrete and you want to get that perfect shot of it, this camera can do it well with 240 FPS. That's you can slow down a lot with that, but I would have liked to see the options of 480 and 960 FPS since they spoiled us with this camera. Now the third and final feature that they removed from the Sony FX6, which I actually use a lot, is the buffer mode slow motion on this camera. With the buffer mode, what it pretty much does is that the camera pretty much records constantly, but doesn't save it until you press the button. So for example, let's say you're shooting sports and you just want to get a slow-mo shot of someone, kicking the ball. You don't have to be shooting the entire time, you just have to point the camera at them. And while you're pointing the camera at them, they do that perfect shot, then you can just press record and records the last 4 or 8 seconds that just happened in slow motion. This feature is amazing because if you're shooting, wildlife especially, you're just sitting there just waiting for the animal to do that, thing that you're waiting for it to do. You're maybe waiting for a bird to come in and just swoop into the water and grab a fish, but you don't want to be recording the entire time, because if you're waiting there for an hour long, you don't want to record an hour long of footage and then, deal with going through that. With the buffer mode, what you can do is you can just wait there and then just press the button, and you know that once you go home and you look at your footage, that 8-second clip you recorded, something important happened, and then it just makes the editing flow way easier, and you don't have to worry about having like giant long files that you have to go through to find those perfect moments. Things that it's not perfect, to be honest, because there's a lot of problems with it. For example, when you do press record, you have to wait for the camera to pretty much process that file, and depending on how much you slow it down, it can take from like 10-15 seconds to like a minute long for the camera to do it. And in that time frame, something else that could happen and you'll just miss out on that because the camera is too busy processing the footage. But it is cool to have that option, because this camera you can shoot up to 120 fps and 1080p if you bought the high frame rate upgrade, or if you have the Mark II of the camera. So you have both options. You can either just shoot continuously in slow motion, or you can do that trigger mode that's super useful in certain situations, which for some reason they removed with the Sony FX6. But I think that's it when it comes to the downsides of the FX6, because that camera is amazing. It's going to be amazing for, any corporate video shooter like me, or if you're doing documentaries. Heck, you can even like shoot a movie on it if you put an external recorder on it and shoot raw out of it. It's quite amazing. And even though I love my Sony FS5, there are some problems I have with it. For example, it doesn't do autofocus really. And nowadays I actually use autofocus a lot with these Sony cameras because the autofocus on them are pretty much perfect. And the camera also has gyroscope data built into it. If you're shooting with an unstabilized lens, in post you can pretty much perfectly stabilize it and make it look like a gimbal shot. It's quite amazing what you can do with the gyro data coming out of those cameras. Hey guys, future react here. I forgot to also mention that one of the big reasons that FX6 is a lot better than FS5 is because it has dual native ISO. With the Sony FS5, it was never a good low light camera. Once you went over the native ISO, which is 800, the video quality started degrading big time. But with the FX6 though, the native ISO is 800, which is the same as the FS5. Now it also has 12,000 as its native ISO, so if you're in low light situations, it's going to be a great camera, just like the A7S III is, which is a huge deal, because with the FS5, again, you can only use it if you have proper lighting with it. But now with the FS6, you're going to be able to use it in low light conditions. It's also a full frame camera, so it's just going to do way better in low light overall. And also, since it is full frame, you're going to be able to use your full frame lenses without having to worry about crops. Personally, I pretty much own exclusively full frame lenses, because when I got my A7R III, I knew that future is going to be full frame. We're not going to be, getting more crop body sensors with these cameras. I was like, you know what, I'm just going to buy full frame lenses from now on, and obviously it's paying off right now. But anyways guys, thanks for watching, hope you enjoyed this video. I am going to be getting a Sony FX6 in the future, so once I get that, I'm going to be making a lot of videos of it, comparing that camera to the Sony FS5 and the A7R III that we got right here. But I'll see you guys next week on the next week's video, and goodbye.